I was reading about this mid-level Soviet bureaucrat in the early 1920s, a man most of his peers dismissed as a gray blur. While the charismatic Leon Trotsky was busy electrifying stadium crowds with visions of global revolution, this man, Joseph Stalin, stayed in the shadows. He didn't want the spotlight. He wanted the filing cabinets. He took the job of general secretary, a role everyone else thought was a dead-end desk job for a bean counter. But while Trotsky was out making history, Stalin was quietly making appointments. He was moving folders, promoting loyalists to obscure regional posts, and slowly weaving a web of debt and duty that would eventually trap an entire continent. It's fascinating and terrifying how a man who looked like a board clerk managed to turn a country's entire reality into a hall of mirrors. A world where the morning paper, the radio, and even your child's history book weren't just biased. They were rewritten daily to fit the whims of one person. In this world, art wasn't for expression. It was a tool. If you were a poet like Anna Akhmatova and you wrote the wrong metaphor, you didn't just get a bad review. You faced a bullet or a slow death in the Siberian labor camp. But what truly sticks with me is the cold, bureaucratic nature of the horror that followed. In 1937, a document was circulated called Order Number 00447. It wasn't a military strategy or an economic plan. It was a spreadsheet for murder. It established literal quotas numbers on a page for how many people in each region needed to be shot that month and how many needed to be disappeared into the gulag. How does a society reach a point where execution becomes a clerical exercise? How does a gray blur transition from filing papers to orchestrating a man-made famine that starved millions of Ukrainians just to break their spirit? To understand the absolute control of Joseph Stalin, we have to look past the dictator and into the terrifyingly efficient machinery he built to turn fear into a way of life. And that is exactly where we're going today. We aren't just doing a biography. We are looking at the machinery. We're looking at how you take a society and, well, fundamentally rewire it piece by piece.
It's a terrifying blueprint. When we look at the research, the archives, the memoirs, it all points to this systemic dismantling of what makes us human.
Right.
We aren't just talking about a tyrant. We're talking about an architect. And to understand the architecture, we have to look at three specific mechanisms.
Okay.
First, how do you capture the institutions? How do you turn a government into a weapon? We'll dive into how bureaucratic incentives can be manipulated to replace merit with just pure loyalty.
The clinical blueprint.
The clinical blueprint. Second, how do you deconstruct a society? We need to look at the Holodomor in Ukraine not just as a tragedy, but as a deliberate social engineering project designed to dissolve the family, the community, the entire social ecosystem. The imposition of anomie, that's a sociological term we'll get into, but essentially, how do you destroy truth? How do you weaponize the media and art to create that hall of mirrors you mentioned, a place where no one can even trust their own eyes?
That nickname really stuck with me. It implies he was invisible, boring even.
And that was his greatest camouflage. You have to put yourself in the mindset of the Bolshevik elite in, say, 1922. These are intellectuals.
Right, the big thinkers.
Absolutely. Trotsky, Kamenev, Zinoviev, these guys were writers, orators. They spent their time debating Marxist theory in cafes in Vienna or Paris before the revolution. They really saw themselves as the brain of the entire movement.
And Stalin was?
Stalin was the hand. He was the guy who robbed banks to fund the party. He was the guy who organized strikes. He was the enforcer. He wasn't seen as a deep thinker at all.
He was the muscle.
He was the muscle. So when the position of general secretary was created, nobody wanted it. It sounded like secretarial work. It was, paperwork, personnel files, scheduling.
It's the bean counter job. While Trotsky's out there commanding the Red Army and looking like a revolutionary rock star, Stalin is sitting in some dusty office checking attendance rolls.
But here is the mechanism, the brilliant, terrifying mechanism that the intellectuals missed. In a massive centralized state like the Soviet Union was becoming, the person who controls the personnel files controls the state. It's what historians now call the circular flow of power.
Okay, the circular flow. Because on paper, the Communist Party was supposed to be democratic, right? The members vote for the leaders.
In theory, yes. Power is supposed to flow up from the bottom. The local party members elect delegates to the party Congress, and then the Congress elects the Central Committee, which then elects the Politburo and the General Secretary.
But Stalin hacks the system.
He completely hacked it. As General Secretary, he had the power of appointment, Nomenklatura. He could assign people to run the local party branches in the provinces, in the Urals, in the Caucasus, in Siberia, all over.
Yes, I'm Stalin. I see a vacancy for the party boss in, say, Vladivostok. I don't hold an election for it. I just pick a guy.
You pick your guy, and you don't pick the smartest guy or the most competent. You pick someone who is maybe a bit mediocre, someone who wouldn't get the job on merit alone. You give him the post.
And suddenly he owes me.
He owes you everything. Suddenly, this guy has a salary, he has a car, he has status, he has power, he has access to better food, he owes his entire existence to you. This is patronage on a massive scale.
It's like a feudal lord and a knight.
Yeah.
I give you the land, you give me your sword. Basic.
Precisely. Now, fast forward to the next party congress, that guy you appointed in Vladivostok. He is now a delegate. Who is he going to vote for?
He's going to vote for the guy who gave him the job. He's going to vote for Stalin. It's self-preservation.
And there is the circle. Stalin appoints the voters elect Stalin. It's a completely closed loop. It effectively eliminated any chance of him ever being removed democratically. By the time Trotsky and the others realized what was happening,
It was too late.
the room was already filled with Stalin's employees. They had been outmaneuvered not by a brilliant speech or a military strategy, but by administrative procedure.
It's such a boring way to seize power. It's not a coup d'etat with tanks storming the palace. It's a coup by the HR department.
It is administrative capture. And the consequences for the actual governance of the country were, well, catastrophic. Because think about what that does to competence.
Right. If the only qualification for the job is loyalty to Stalin, you aren't necessarily getting the best engineers or the best economists or the best agronomists.
You're getting the best sycophants, the best bootlickers. Competence becomes a secondary or even a tertiary concern.
I was actually looking at this account recently. Let's call the author Victor. He was a mid-level administrator in Moscow during this transition period, the early 20s. And Victor was what you'd call a true believer, a meritocrat.
He believed in the project.
He honestly believed the revolution was about putting the most capable people in charge to build a new world. A technocrat's dream, you know. He describes this creeping horror in his office. He watched as the gray blur, Stalin started moving the filing cabinets, as you said. Victor saw his colleagues, men who were brilliant logisticians, men who knew how to run the railways or manage food distribution, suddenly being bypassed.
Bypassed for who?
For the loyalists. Victor describes these new guys coming in from the provinces. They couldn't draft a coherent policy paper, they didn't understand basic economics, but they knew exactly which slogans to recite. They knew exactly whose boots to lick. They were apparatchiks. That must be terrifying. Just sitting at your desk, knowing you're good at your job, but realizing that your competence is actually a liability.
A huge liability.
Because if you're smart, you might have your own ideas. You might question an order. And independent ideas are dangerous.
That's exactly what Victor felt. He called it a quiet dread. It wasn't loud. It was just the slow, sinking feeling that the whole enterprise was being hollowed out from the inside. Eventually, Victor himself was reassigned to some dead-end post in the middle of nowhere, replaced by a clerk whose only discernible skill was unwavering devotion. This is the clinical blueprint for institutional capture. It wasn't a sudden explosion. It was the slow, systematic replacement of merit with ideological loyalty.
It hollows out the state. You're left with a shell that looks like a government, but the inside is just rotten.
It creates the Nomenklatura.
Nomenklatura. What does it actually mean in practice? It sounds very official.
Literally, it means a list of names. It was a list of key government and industrial positions that could only be filled with party approval. But in practice, it became a new social class, a new aristocracy almost.
So it's not just a job roster.
No, if you were on the Nomenklatura, you didn't just have a job, you had access.
Access to what? In a worker's paradise, what does access even mean?
To life. You have to remember, this is a scarcity economy. There's not enough of anything to go around. Being on the list meant you had access to the special stores. The Restpletelid, where you could get sausage, butter, proper shoes, things the average worker never, ever saw.
The perks.
The perks. You got the good apartment in a building, like the house on the embankment. You got the dacha in the countryside for the summer. You got better medical care.
So it's golden handcuffs. You're trapped by the good life.
Platinum handcuffs. Because if you lose the job, you don't just go on unemployment, you lose the apartment, you lose the food, your family starves. Or by the 30s, you and your family go to the gulag or face a bullet in the back of the head.
So the incentive to conform, to just agree with whatever the boss says, is absolute.
It's total. Nobody could stand up. The machinery was designed to filter out dissent before it even formed, and this bureaucratic capture was the necessary foundation for the terror that followed. You asked earlier how execution becomes a clerical exercise.
Order 00447. That document is just chilling.
Yes. July 1937. This is the culmination of the bureaucratization of murder. Stalin and Yezhov, the head of the NKVD at the time, didn't just issue a vague order to go kill enemies. They sent out a table, a literal spreadsheet.
Break down the columns for us. What did it look like? What was on this spreadsheet for murder?
It was incredibly mundane, which is what makes it so horrifying. It listed all the regions, Moscow, Leningrad, the Ukrainian SSR, etc. And then it had two main categories. Category 1, to be shot. Category 2, to be imprisoned in the gulag, typically for 8 to 10 years. And next to those categories, there were numbers, quotas.
Quota, like a sales target. We need to hit our numbers this quarter, but instead of selling toasters, we're executing 2,000 people. Same.
It is the industrialization of death. It's taking the logic of a 5-year plan for tractor production and applying it to human lives. And here is the darkest part, the part that reveals the absolute success of that circular flow we talked about.
What did the local guys do? The ones who owed Stalin their jobs.
The local party secretaries, the guys Stalin appointed, received these quotas. Did they say, this is madness? Did they say, there aren't that many spies or Trotskyites in my region?
I have a feeling I know the answer, and I don't like it.
They wrote back to Moscow asking for higher quotas.
Wait, they asked to kill more people?
Yes, we have the telegrams. They would write to Stalin saying, I have uncovered a massive nest of spies and wreckers here. The initial quota is insufficient. Please increase my Category 1 limit by 1,000, or 2,000, or 8,000. Because they wanted to prove their loyalty. They wanted to show the patron, the boss, that they were vigilant, that they were efficient managers. They were competing with each other. They gamified the terror. It was a race to see who could be the most ruthless.
It's nauseating. It completely depersonalizes the horror. It turns human beings into a KPI, a key performance indicator.
That is the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt talked about, but on a systemic industrial scale. When you turn murder into a bureaucratic process with forms and stamps and quotas, you remove the moral weight. It's just paperwork. And the gray blur was the master of paperwork.
So we have the state captured, the meritocracy is dead, replaced by this terrified and ruthless clientelist network. But Stalin didn't just want to control the government. He wanted to reshape the very structure of society itself.
Yeah, the old world had to be destroyed to build the new one.
And nowhere is this more evident than in the countryside, particularly in Ukraine.
We need to talk about the Holodomor.
The Great Famine in Ukraine, 1932, 1933. It's a topic that is still so raw, so debated.
It is. And for a long time, the official Soviet narrative, and even some Western narratives for that matter, was that this was just a policy failure. Bad weather, bad management. Maybe they took too much grain to sell abroad, to buy machinery for industrialization.
Dizzy with success, as Stalin himself wrote. Just some overzealous officials getting carried away. A tragic mistake.
But when you look at the archives, the decrees, the specific orders, the internal communications, that narrative just completely falls apart. This wasn't an accident. This was what sociologists would call social deconstruction. It was a targeted strike against a specific social order.
And who was the target?
The Kurkul.
The wealthy peasant. That's the image we always get. The greedy farmer hoarding grain.
That's the propaganda term. But in reality, a kulak could be anyone. It was any farmer who was independent, any farmer who hired another laborer, any farmer who had 2 cows instead of 1, any farmer who had a sense of identity that wasn't derived from the state.
So it wasn't about wealth, it was about independence.
Exactly. And in Ukraine, the village structure was incredibly strong. There was a sense of individual property, yes, but also deep communal bonds, tradition, religion, a distinct national identity. The Ukrainian peasant was not a blank slate.
They were the spine of the nation, effectively.
And Stalin knew that as long as that spine remained intact, he could never truly control Ukraine. He saw Ukrainian nationalism as a direct threat. He needed to break it.
I read an account recently that really brought this home to me on a human level. It wasn't about the politics. It was about the family. It was about a woman, we'll call her Olena, living in a village near Poltava during that terrible winter of 32.
What did she describe?
It was the breakdown of what she called the organicism of the village. We usually think of famine as just hunger, a lack of food. But Olena talked about the fear. The state had turned the schools into indoctrination centers.
Right.
They were teaching children that their parents were enemies of the people if they hid so much as a single potato. They were enemies for trying to feed their own families.
The Pavlik-Morozov archetype.
Right. The boy who famously denounced his own father and was held up as a national hero for it. a martyr for the state. Solina describes this moment where she's hiding a handful of beans under a floorboard, literally just enough to keep them alive for another day. And she looks over as her own young son. And instead of feeling just love or just pity for his hunger, she feels the sudden sharp spike of fear. Will he tell?
That is the moment the society breaks, the very instant.
The nuclear family is the most basic unit of survival. It's the one place where you were supposed to be safe. When the state inserts itself between a mother and child, when it weaponizes that most sacred relationship, that's not just resource extraction. That is psychological demolition.
It's the total atomization of the individual. And structurally, the mechanism they used to enforce this was incredibly specific and cruel. It wasn't just, give us your grain, we have to talk about the blackboards, the chorny dashki.
This is a detail I think a lot of people don't know about. What exactly was a blackboard?
It was a blacklist. But in a command economy, where the state controls everything, a blacklist is a death sentence. If a village failed to meet its grain quota, which was often set at an impossibly high level on purpose, it was placed on the blackboard.
And what did that mean for the people living there?
It meant a total economic blockade. The state didn't just come and take the wheat from the harvest. They closed the state stores. They banned all trade. They sent in brigades of party activists who would go house to house with long metal pikes.
What were the pikes for?
To poke into the ground, into walls, into ovens, searching for any hidden food, and they confiscated everything. Potatoes, beets, cabbage, whatever people had stored for winter, but also the very means of survival. They took the salt.
Salt? Why salt? That seems so petty.
It's not petty, it's diabolical. Without salt, you can't preserve food. You can't cure a bit of meat or fish for the winter. Taking the salt was ensuring that they would starve later, even if they found something to eat today. They took the kerosene, so you couldn't light your home or cook. They took the matches.
It was a calculated attempt to push these communities back into the Stone Age, and then just watch them die.
It's a siege. It's a medieval siege of your own citizens.
And then there's what you could call the smoking gun.
Yeah.
Because even with all that, people will still say maybe it was just incompetence, a policy that got out of hand.
Right. But on January 20th, 1933, Stalin and Molotov signed a secret decree. It's a document you can now read in the archives. It specifically forbade peasants in Ukraine and the Kuban region, which was also heavily Ukrainian, from leaving their districts to seek food.
They closed the borders.
They set up military cordons. They put roadblocks at the train stations and on the roads leading out of Ukraine. If you were a starving man or woman and you tried to walk to the city to beg for bread or try to cross into Russia where there was food, the army would turn you back or shoot you.
That proves intent. That's not negligence. If I lock you in a room and take away all the food and then I stand guard at the door so you can't leave, I am murdering you.
It was containment. They were sentenced to death in place. And the result, as Elena's story hinted, was the total collapse of the societal ecosystem. It wasn't just bodies piling up. The very culture died.
The rituals, the things that make us human.
There were no funerals. Bodies were just collected by carts and dumped in mass graves unceremoniously. The meza, the property boundary that had been sacred to peasants for centuries, was erased by collectivization. The psychological dislocation was profound.
And the starti, I read about them.
The blind musicians, the bards, they were the keepers of the culture. They traveled from village to village playing the bandura and singing the oral history of Ukraine, the epic poems, the folk songs. They were the national memory in human form.
And what happened to them?
They were rounded up and executed. In one infamous incident, hundreds were invited to a conference and then shot. You kill the memory, you kill the family bonds, and you starve the body.
And you drive the survivors into a state of madness.
We have to be honest about the level of trauma here. The archives are full of NKVD reports describing the psychological landscape. They talk about mass apathy, people just lying down in their homes to wait for death. They talk about a rise in insanity, anomie, a state of complete normlessness.
The social contract just evaporated.
Petty theft skyrocketed, not because people were suddenly criminals, but because the rules no longer applied. Neighbors who lived together for generations turned on each other for a crust of bread.
And the darkest taboo, necrophagy.
Cannibalism. Yes, it happened. It was widespread enough that the regime actually printed and distributed posters saying, "To eat your own children is a barbarian act."
I can't even process that.
Yeah.
Imagine a government that creates the conditions where that poster is necessary and then has the audacity to blame the victims for being barbarians.
It's forcing a population to descend into animalism, and then using that descent as justification for their own destruction. It was the complete destruction of the human spirit. By the time the famine ended, the spine of the Ukrainian countryside was broken, the independent peasant was gone, the family was shattered, the survivors were traumatized into a deep, deep silence. And that silence is what allowed the Soviet system to cement itself.
So we have the bureaucracy captured and turned into a weapon. We have the physical resistance of the countryside broken and starved into submission.
Yeah.
But you can't starve everyone. You need a workforce. You need people in the cities, in the factories, in the army. How do you control them?
Right. Terror alone is inefficient. It's too costly.
You need them to believe, or maybe not believe.
Or at least you need them to lose the ability to disbelieve. This brings us to the third mechanism, the imposition of anomie through the Hall of Mirrors.
The media, the propaganda, the culture.
But it's so much more than just fake news or biased reporting. It's about replacing reality itself with a state-sanctioned fiction.
I want to bring in another perspective here that I was reading about. It's about the construction of the Moscow Metro in the 30s, which, by the way, is an architectural marvel. It's a palace for the people. But there was this worker, let's call him Pavel.
A typical proletarian, the hero of the state.
Right. And Pavel is living in a communal apartment, probably 5 families sharing one kitchen and one bathroom. It's crowded, it smells like boiled cabbage and wet wool. He's hungry half the time because rationing is tight. He knows people from his apartment block are disappearing at night. He hears the Black Marias, the police vans pulling up.
That's his lived reality. Cold, gray, fearful, and hungry.
But then, every morning, he walks out onto the street, and what does he see? Massive, vibrant, colorful posters, socialist realism.
The official and only aesthetic of the regime.
He sees these heroic paintings of tables groaning under the weight of fruit and roasted meats. He sees laughing, muscular workers with perfect teeth, joyfully building the future. He sees Stalin smiling benevolently, holding a little girl with the caption, "Best friend of all children."
Life has become better, comrades. Life has become more joyous. That was the official slogan, repeated everywhere.
So Pavel is experiencing this profound cognitive dissonance. He describes a bizarre sensation of living in 2 worlds. He knows the poster is a lie, his stomach knows it's a lie, but the poster is the only thing that is allowed to be real.
The Soviet state weaponized media to create a monopoly on truth. Socialist realism wasn't art in any traditional sense. It was engineering. Stalin famously called writers engineers of the human soul. It meant that art's job wasn't to reflect reality. That was considered bourgeois and decadent. If you painted a starving peasant in 1933, you weren't being honest. You were shot for anti-Soviet agitation. Art's job was to depict reality as it should be in the future communist utopia.
They had this strange distinction between reality and essence.
Right. The mundane reality might be that you are starving and your neighbor was just arrested. But the grand historical essence is that the proletariat is marching triumphantly toward communism and everything is great. And if you focus on the starving part, you are focusing on the trivial, temporary reality and ignoring the greater, more important essence. You are a pessimist, a wrecker.
It's gaslighting on a national scale. It's telling an entire population that what they see with their own eyes is wrong.
And think about what that does to Pavel over time. He starts to doubt his own sanity. If every single newspaper, every radio broadcast, every movie, every teacher in his child's school says we are living in paradise and he feels hungry, maybe he is the problem. Maybe he is the one who is wrong or ungrateful or defective.
And even if you know you weren't wrong, you can't say it. You can't voice that doubt.
You can't say it to your wife because she might be scared and tell you to be quiet. You can't say it to your children because they will repeat it at school and get the whole family in trouble. You can't say it to your coworker because he might be an informer for the NKVD.
So you go silent. You put on the mask.
You retreat into yourself. This is the atomization we talked about in the village, but now applied to the entire country. The shared reality, the ability to look at a neighbor and say, man, things are really tough right now, that vanishes. Civil society is based on shared truth. When you destroy the shared truth, you destroy civil society.
And the only thing left to cling to, the only central point in that confusing hall of mirrors is the one thing that never changes: the leader.
The cult of personality. This is where it functions not just as an expression of Stalin's vanity, but as a structural necessity for the system. In a world of chaos, where laws don't matter, where tradition is dead, where your neighbor might be a spy, Stalin is the constant. He is the sun around which everything orbits. He is the source of all wisdom.
It's almost religious in its structure.
It is entirely religious. It was designed to be. The icon corner in the peasant's hut was replaced by the portrait of Lenin and Stalin. The procession of the cross was replaced by the May Day parade. And truth is revealed from above. It flows down the hierarchy. Stalin, the genius leader, knows the absolute truth. He tells the Politburo, they tell the party cadres, they tell the masses.
And to question that flow isn't just a political disagreement.
It's heresy. Or it's a sign of mental illness. If you disagree with the party, you must be mad. Because the party is history itself moving forward. You are trying to stand in the way of a locomotive.
I remember reading about this concept of the lizard in literature from this time.
Yes, the Yasharitsa. A fascinating idea.
The idea that the few brave writers who are left, people like Bulgakov, Babel, or Plekhanov, would try to slip these lizards past the censors. Little camouflage truths.
Right. A metaphor here, a line of ironic dialogue there that hinted at the darkness, at the absurdity. It was a desperate, dangerous game of hide and seek with the state. But for the vast majority of people, for the Pavels of the world, the lizard wasn't enough.
No, they were drowning.
They were drowning in the Hall of Mirrors. They learned to speak Bolshevik. They learned to say the right words in the party meeting, even if the words meant nothing to them.
The double life. That became a fundamental survival skill.
Thinking one thing, saying another, that splits the psyche. It creates a cynical, fearful, passive population. And that passivity is the ultimate goal of the dictator. You don't need everyone to be a fanatical supporter. You just need them to be too confused, too tired, and too isolated to resist.
Effective. When you lay it all out like this, the three lenses, it really shows the totality of the system.
It's the definition of totalitarianism, control over every aspect of life.
Yes, let's put the three pillars together. To build this machine, Stalin needed all three operating at once.
First, bureaucratic capture. That's the gray blur and the clientelism, the Nomenklatura. You control the jobs, the food, the apartments. You make everyone dependent on the state for their physical survival. You replace merit with loyalty.
That's the filing cabinet, the foundation.
Second, physical deconstruction. That's the Holodomor and the terror. You break the independent social structures, the village, the church, the family. You use famine and borders and secret police to crush any potential resistance before it can even organize.
That's the gun and the hunger, the physical enforcement.
And third, psychological imposition. That's the Hall of Mirrors. You use the media, the art, the cult of personality to destroy the shared reality. You make truth a monopoly of the state so that people can no longer trust their own senses.
And the result is a silence that lasts for generations. A society of atoms.
Exactly. Isolated individuals who fear one another and look only vertically to the state for survival and for truth. The legacy of this is profound. Even after Stalin died, these structures, these habits of mind remained. The fear of speaking out, the distrust of the neighbor, the reliance on the strong hand. It takes a long, long time for a society to heal from that kind of surgery.
It really makes you look at the fragility of civil society in a new way. We sort of take it for granted that we can generally trust the news or trust our neighbors, or that the person running the department is basically qualified for the job.
We shouldn't take it for granted. These things are fragile. They are built on trust and shared norms. And as the story of the gray blur shows, they can be dismantled. Not always with a bang, but with a quiet shuffle of papers in a back room.
You know, we started this deep dive talking about a boring administrator, a man no one paid attention to. We ended up uncovering one of the darkest and most efficient mechanisms of control in human history. It's heavy, but it's absolutely necessary to understand.
Knowledge is the only inoculation against it happening again in any form.
Absolutely. We are just about out of time, but I want to leave you with one final thought to chew on. It is unsettling to realize that the most effective tool of total control wasn't the gun or the prison camp, though those were used liberally. It was the ability to redefine the truth so completely that the population began to police itself. When a government succeeds in making the official narrative more real to its citizens than the hunger in their own bellies, the prison walls are no longer necessary. They've been built inside the mind. 5. Stay curious, stay critical, and we'll catch you next time.